a billionaire, a single mum, and a simple act of kindness that changed everything. When Richard Vaughan gave a hungry boy a meal, he never expected it to lead to love, betrayal, and a fight for the future he never knew he wanted. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The evening sun cast long shadows over the busy streets of Westport as Richard Vaughan stepped out of Bruno's, the most expensive restaurant in town. At 53, Richard had the confident stride of a man who owned half the city. His custom suit fit perfectly over his tall frame, and his salt and pepper hair gave him the distinguished look of success. "Mr. Vaughan, your car is ready," said the valet, holding the door to the sleek black Mercedes. Richard nodded and handed the young man a $100 bill. "Keep the change." The valet's eyes widened. "Thank you, sir." It was just another Tuesday for Richard. Business meetings, important phone calls, and dinner at Bruno's, a routine that had defined his life for the past 20 years. As CEO of Vaughan Enterprises, his days were filled with decisions that affected thousands of employees. Tonight, he'd just closed a deal worth millions. He was about to get into his car when something caught his eye. A small boy, no older than 10, was sitting on the curb across the street. Even from a distance, Richard could see the boy's worn-out clothes and the way he stared at people walking out of the burger place next to Bruno's. There was a look in the child's eyes that Richard recognized: hunger. Richard paused, his hand on the car door. He wasn't sure why, but something made him walk across the street instead of driving away. "Hey, kid," he said, kneeling down despite his expensive suit. "Are you hungry?" The boy looked up, startled. He had dark, serious eyes and a thin face that showed signs of missed meals. He hesitated, then nodded shyly. Without thinking twice, Richard reached into the takeout bag he was carrying. He'd ordered an extra burger out of habit, even though he never ate it. "Here," he said, handing the wrapped burger to the boy. "No need to pay me back." The boy's face lit up like a Christmas tree. Thank you, sir." His small hands grabbed the food, but he didn't immediately unwrap it. "What's your name?" Richard asked. "Tommy." "Tommy Mills," the boy replied. "Where do you live, Tommy? It's getting dark. Shouldn't you be home?" Tommy pointed down the street. "We live in the Oakwood Apartments. Mom's working late again, but she'll be home soon." Richard frowned. The Oakwood Apartments were known to be one of the most run-down buildings in town, a far cry from his mansion in the hills. "Do you need me to walk you home?" Richard asked, surprising himself with the offer. Tommy shook his head. "No, thank you. I know the way, and thank you for the food, sir." Richard nodded, watching as the boy carefully tucked the burger into his jacket pocket and started walking away. For a moment, he thought about following him to make sure he got home safely, but his phone rang, another business call that needed his attention. By the time he got home to his empty mansion, Richard had almost forgotten about the boy. Almost. The next morning, Richard was in his home office when his housekeeper, Martha, knocked on the door. "Mr. Vaughan, there's a child at the front door asking to see you. Says his name is Tommy." Richard looked up from his computer, confused. "Tommy? How would a child know where I live? He says you gave him food yesterday. Should I send him away?" Richard's memory clicked into place. No, let him in." A minute later, Tommy stood in the doorway of Richard's office, looking even smaller, surrounded by the mansion's opulence. In his hands, he held a simple dish wrapped in foil. "My mom made this for you," Tommy said, beaming with pride. "We don't have much, but she wanted to say thank you for the burger you gave me." Richard felt something strange in his chest, a tightening sensation he couldn't explain. He stood up and walked around his massive desk to accept the offering. "That's very thoughtful," he said, carefully taking the dish. "You didn't have to do that." "Mom says we always pay back kindness," Tommy explained seriously, "even if it's just a little." Richard unwrapped the foil to find a homemade meal, a simple casserole with a note attached. The note read, "Thank you for feeding my son. In a world where many look away, you stop to help. With gratitude, Sarah Mills." The handwriting was neat but hurried, as if written by someone who didn't have much time to spare. Richard stared at the meal, suddenly realizing he hadn't eaten anything homemade in years. His fridge was stocked by a service, his meals prepared by chefs or ordered from restaurants. This simple dish, made with obvious care despite limited resources, struck him in a way he hadn't expected. "Would you like to come in for a minute?" Richard asked, surprising himself again. Tommy nodded and stepped into the office, his eyes wide as he took in the high ceilings, expensive furniture, and wall of awards. "Wow, your house is like a castle," Tommy exclaimed. Richard smiled, gesturing for Tommy to sit in one of the leather chairs across from his desk. "Hey, it's just a house, big but empty most of the time." He sat down across from the boy. "Tell me about your family, Tommy." Tommy's expression grew serious. "It's just me and Mom now. Dad died when I was 6. Mom works at the hospital cleaning rooms, and then she has another job at night sometimes. She works really hard." "I'm sorry about your father," Richard said quietly. "That must be difficult." Tommy nodded. "Mom says we have to be strong. She's teaching me to be a good man, like my dad was." "She sounds like a remarkable woman," Richard said, genuinely impressed. "She is," Tommy agreed enthusiastically. "She always helps people, even when we don't have much ourselves. Last month, when our neighbor, Mrs. Perez, got sick, Mom made food for her family every day, even though we barely had enough for ourselves." Richard felt a pang in his chest. Here was a family with almost nothing, yet they gave what little they had. Meanwhile, he had more money than he could spend in a lifetime. And when was the last time he'd truly helped someone without expecting something in return? "What does your mom like to do when she's not working?" Richard asked, suddenly wanting to know more about this woman who raised such a thoughtful child. Tommy thought for a moment. "She likes to read, and she sings really pretty when she thinks I'm asleep." His face lit up. "Oh, and she has this dream of opening a small restaurant someday. She's an amazing cook, but—" His voice trailed off. "But what?" "But she says dreams are nice, but paying the rent is more important." Richard nodded slowly, thinking about the millions sitting in his bank accounts, while this hard-working woman couldn't even pursue a simple dream. "Tommy, would you like to show me where you live? I'd like to thank your mother in person for this meal." Tommy's eyes widened. "Really? You want to come to our apartment? It's not fancy like this place." "That doesn't matter to me," Richard said, and for the first time in years he meant it. An hour later, Richard's Mercedes pulled up in front of the Oakwood apartments. The building was even worse than he'd imagined. Cracked concrete, peeling paint, and a general air of neglect. He followed Tommy up 3 flights of stairs because the elevator was broken. "Mom might not be home yet," Tommy warned as they reached apartment 304. "She sometimes picks up extra shifts." But when Tommy pushed open the door, a woman's voice called out from inside. "Tommy, is that you?" "Yeah, Mom, and I brought someone to meet you." Richard stepped into the small apartment behind Tommy and found himself face to face with Sarah Mills. She was in her early 30s, with the same dark eyes as her son. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore scrubs that had seen better days. Despite obvious exhaustion, there was a quiet dignity in the way she carried herself. "Mr. Vaughn," she said, clearly shocked to see a man in an expensive suit standing in her living room. "Please call me Richard," he said, extending his hand. "I wanted to thank you personally for the meal you sent. It was very kind of you." Sarah shook his hand, embarrassment crossing her face. "It was nothing compared to what you did for Tommy when he told me a man in a nice suit gave him food." She paused, emotion crossing her face. "Well, there aren't many people who would stop to help a child they don't know." Richard looked around the apartment. It was small but spotlessly clean. What few possessions they had were well cared for. A bookshelf held worn paperbacks, and the walls displayed Tommy's school artwork. This was a home filled with love, if not material wealth. "Your son is a remarkable young man," Richard said. "You've done an amazing job raising him." Sarah's eyes softened with pride. "Thank you. He's my whole world." As they talked, Richard learned more about Sarah's life. How she worked 60 hours a week between her 2 jobs. How she still made time to volunteer at Tommy's school. How she'd been saving for years to try to move them to a better neighborhood, but emergency expenses always seemed to eat away at her savings. Tommy mentioned, "You dream of opening a restaurant someday," Richard said. Sarah smiled, a flash of passion lighting up her tired eyes. "Just a small place, nothing fancy. Good, honest food that brings people together. The smile faded. But that's just a dream. Reality is about making sure Tommy has what he needs. By the time Richard left the Mills apartment, something fundamental had shifted inside him. The contrast between his empty mansion filled with expensive things and this tiny apartment overflowing with love and sacrifice had shaken him to his core. That night, as he sat alone in his dining room eating the casserole Sarah had made, which was delicious, Richard made a decision. The next day, he called his lawyer and his financial advisor. 1 week later, Sarah was working her usual shift at the hospital when she was called to the administrator's office. Worried she had done something wrong, she hurried there, only to find Richard Vaughan waiting with the hospital director. "What's going on?" she asked nervously. Richard smiled. "Sarah, I've been doing some thinking since we met. Your kindness and integrity have reminded me of something important that I lost sight of years ago." The hospital director handed Sarah an envelope. "Ms. Mills, Mr. Vaughan has established a scholarship fund for hospital employees looking to further their education or start a business. You're the first recipient." Sarah opened the envelope with trembling hands to find a check for $50,000 and documents for enrollment in a business management program at the local college. "I don't understand," she whispered, looking at Richard with tears in her eyes. "You fed me when I was already full," Richard said simply. "Now I want to help you feed others. That restaurant of yours? It's time to make it more than a dream." Sarah's hands flew to her mouth. "I can't accept this, it's too much." "It's not charity," Richard assured her. "It's an investment in someone who deserves a chance. All I ask is that when your restaurant succeeds, you help someone else the way I'm helping you." As tears streamed down Sarah's face, Richard felt something warm spread through his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in decades. For the first time since he began building his empire, Richard Vaughan realized there were some returns on investment that couldn't be measured in dollars. And this was just the beginning. 2 months had passed since Richard Vaughan had walked into the Mills' small apartment. The once cold businessman found himself thinking more and more about Sarah and Tommy. They had awakened something in him that he thought had died years ago: empathy. "Mr. Vaughan, your 10 o'clock appointment is here," his assistant announced through the intercom. Richard straightened his tie and closed the folder on his desk. Today was an important day. The real estate agent was bringing the final papers for the building he had purchased in downtown Westport. "Send them in, Patricia." The door opened, and a stylishly dressed woman entered, carrying a leather portfolio. "Good morning, Mr. Vaughan. I have everything ready for your signature." As they went through the paperwork, Richard felt an unusual excitement. This wasn't just another business acquisition. This building would soon house Sarah's home kitchen, the restaurant Sarah Mills had dreamed of opening. "And you're sure the renovations can be completed within 3 months?" Richard asked. "Absolutely. The contractors are scheduled to start next week." After signing the documents and writing a substantial check, Richard stood at his office window, looking out at the city he had helped build. For years, his only goal had been to expand his empire, to accumulate more wealth. Now, for the first time, he was using that wealth to truly change someone's life. His phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah. "Tommy got an A on his math test. He says it's because of the new tutor you arranged. I don't know how to thank you enough." Richard smiled, typing back, "He did the work. I just provided the opportunity. Proud of him." Later that day, Richard's black Mercedes pulled up in front of Westport Elementary School. He had made it a habit to pick Tommy up every Wednesday and take him for ice cream, something he looked forward to more than any business meeting. When Tommy bounded down the school steps, his face lit up at the sight of Richard waiting for him. "Richard!" He ran over, his backpack bouncing. "Did Mom tell you about my math test?" "She did." "I'm not surprised. You're a smart kid," Richard said, feeling a warmth in his chest that was becoming familiar whenever he was around Tommy. As they sat in the ice cream parlor, Tommy chatted excitedly about school, his friends, and the changes in his life since Richard had come into it. "Mom says we might be able to move to a new apartment soon, one where the elevator works." Richard nodded, taking a spoonful of his vanilla ice cream. "Your mom is doing very well in her business classes, and she's going to be an excellent restaurant owner." Tommy's face grew serious suddenly. "Why are you helping us so much, Richard? Most rich people don't care about people like us. The question caught Richard off guard. He put down his spoon, thinking carefully about his answer. Tommy, for a long time, I thought success meant having a lot of money and power. I worked so hard to build my business that I forgot what really matters in life. He looked into the boy's earnest eyes. Your mom made me a meal when you had barely enough for yourselves. That simple act of kindness reminded me of who I used to be before I lost my way. Tommy nodded thoughtfully. Mom says kindness is like planting seeds. You might not see the flowers right away, but they grow. Oh, your mom is a very wise woman, Richard said, feeling a flutter in his chest at the mention of Sarah. These days he found himself thinking about her more and more, and not just because of the restaurant project. After dropping Tommy off at home, Richard was surprised when Sarah invited him in for coffee. I've been wanting to talk to you, she said, pouring him a cup at their small kitchen table, about everything you're doing for us. Richard noticed she looked different today. Her hair was down around her shoulders, and there was a new confidence in the way she carried herself. The business classes were clearly having an effect beyond the educational aspect. I'm happy to help, Sarah. You and Tommy deserve it. Sarah shook her head slightly. That's just it, Richard. Nobody deserves this kind of generosity. A scholarship is one thing, but buying a building for my restaurant? Hiring a tutor for Tommy? I'm worried. About what? Richard asked gently. That I'm taking advantage of your kindness, that maybe you feel some kind of obligation because Tommy and I were nice to you once. She looked down at her coffee. I need to know why you're really doing all this. Richard hadn't expected this conversation, but he should have. Sarah wasn't the type to simply accept good fortune without questioning it. When I met you and Tommy, he began slowly, I realized something about my life. I have more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes, but I've been living like a man in poverty. My house is empty. My relationships are mostly business transactions. He met her eyes. You work harder than anyone I've ever met, yet you still find time to care for others, to be kind, to dream. He took a deep breath. I'm not helping you out of obligation, Sarah. I'm helping you because it's the first thing I've done in years that feels completely right. Sarah studied his face, seeming to search for any sign of deception. Finding none, her expression softened. Well, then you should know that your investment won't be wasted. I'm working harder in these classes than I've ever worked before. And I'm developing a business plan that will make the restaurant successful. Richard smiled. I never doubted that for a moment. As he was leaving, Sarah touched his arm lightly. Tommy's baseball game is Saturday morning, if you'd like to come. He'd love to have you there. Richard felt that strange flutter again. I wouldn't miss it. What Richard didn't know was that his sudden interest in Sarah Mills hadn't gone unnoticed. Patricia Henderson, his executive assistant for the past 15 years, had observed the changes in her boss with growing concern, especially when she discovered the substantial sums he was spending on what she considered to be a charity case. The next morning, Patricia entered Richard's office with her usual efficiency, but there was a tension in her manner. Your brother called again, she said, placing a stack of messages on his desk. He says it's urgent that you call him back. Richard sighed. His younger brother James was the CFO of Vaughan Enterprises and had been questioning many of Richard's recent decisions. And the board meeting has been moved up to tomorrow, Patricia continued. Apparently there are concerns about the direction of the company. Richard frowned. What concerns? Patricia hesitated before answering. There are rumors, Mr. Vaughan, about your personal involvement with an employee at Westport Hospital, and questions about certain financial decisions you've made recently. Richard's expression hardened. My personal life is my business, Patricia, and as for my financial decisions, I'm still the CEO of this company. Of course, sir. Patricia's voice was cool. I'm just relaying the information. After she left, Richard sat back in his chair, a sinking feeling in his stomach. He should have expected this. The business world was small, and gossip traveled fast. His sudden interest in helping a single mother from the wrong side of town was bound to raise eyebrows. But what bothered him most was the implication that his relationship with Sarah was somehow inappropriate. Yes, he had feelings for her that went beyond simple charity, but he had been careful not to cross any lines. Sarah was focused on building a better life for Tommy and pursuing her restaurant dream. The last thing she needed was to be the subject of ugly rumors. When he picked Tommy up for their Wednesday ice cream that afternoon, Richard was quieter than usual. "Are you okay?" Tommy asked, perceptive as always. "You seem sad." Richard managed a smile. "Just some work problems, buddy. Nothing for you to worry about." "Mom says everyone has problems, even rich people." "Your mom is right again," Richard said, ruffling Tommy's hair. When they arrived at the Mills apartment afterward, Sarah was waiting with news of her own. "I got an A on my business proposal," she announced excitedly, showing Richard the paper with the professor's comments. "He says my concept for the restaurant is solid and my financial projections are realistic." Richard felt his worries lift at seeing her joy. "That's wonderful, Sarah. I'm so proud of you." "I couldn't have done it without your help," she said, "which is why I wanted to ask you something important." She took a deep breath. "Would you consider being my business partner in the restaurant? Not just the investor, but a real partner." The question caught Richard completely off guard. "You want me as your partner, but you've worked so hard to make this your dream." Sarah nodded, her eyes bright with determination. "Yes, and it still is my dream, but I've learned enough in my classes to know that your experience would be invaluable. Plus," she added with a small smile, "it would make me feel better about accepting your help if we were true partners." Before Richard could respond, his phone rang. Seeing it was his brother, he excused himself to answer. "Richard, we need to talk." James's voice was tight with anger. "The board is meeting tomorrow and they're questioning your fitness to lead the company." "What are you talking about?" Richard demanded, stepping into the hallway outside Sarah's apartment. "I'm talking about you buying a building for your charity case, girlfriend," James snapped. "I'm talking about you missing important meetings because you're playing baseball with her kid. The board thinks you're having some kind of midlife crisis, and frankly, so do I." Richard felt his temper rising. "Sarah Mills is not my charity case girlfriend, and my personal life is none of the board's business. As for the building, it was purchased with my personal funds, not company money." "It doesn't matter," James exclaimed. "Your judgment is being questioned. People are wondering if you're being manipulated by this woman. Do you even know anything about her past? Where she came from before Westport?" "I know everything I need to know," Richard said coldly. "She's hardworking, honest, and has more integrity than most of the people sitting on our board." "Well, those people on the board are calling for a vote of no confidence tomorrow," James replied. "If you want to keep your position, you need to cut ties with this woman and her son. Otherwise, you might find yourself out of the company you built." The call ended, leaving Richard standing in the hallway, his mind racing. The threat was clear: his relationship with Sarah and Tommy, or his position as CEO of Vaughan Enterprises. When he returned to Sarah's apartment, she immediately sensed something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked, concern etching her features. Richard tried to smile. "Just some company politics. Nothing for you to worry about." But as he drove home that night, Richard knew he was facing the most difficult decision of his life. For decades, Vaughan Enterprises had been his identity, his purpose. He had sacrificed everything to build it, including his marriage, which had ended in divorce 15 years ago when his ex-wife couldn't compete with his dedication to the company. Now, for the first time, someone mattered more to him than business success. The thought of cutting Sarah and Tommy out of his life made his chest ache in a way he'd never experienced before. Back at his mansion, Richard poured himself a drink and stood looking out at the city lights. Tomorrow, he would face the board of directors and make a stand. But first, he needed answers to questions he should have asked weeks ago. He picked up his phone and called the private investigator he occasionally used for business matters. "Frank, I need background information on someone. It's urgent." "Name?" the investigator asked. "Sarah Mills, currently residing at the Oakwood Apartments in Westport." "How deep do you want me to go?" Richard hesitated. Was he betraying Sarah's trust by doing this? But if James was right and there was something in her past he should know about, "Everything you can find," he finally said. "I need it by morning." As he hung up, Richard felt a wave of guilt, but he told himself it was necessary. If he was going to put his company on the line for Sarah and Tommy, he needed to be sure they were who they appeared to be. The next morning, Richard woke early after a restless night. A file had been delivered to his home. Frank worked quickly as always. With a sense of dread, Richard opened it and began to read. What he discovered left him stunned. An hour later, Richard walked into the boardroom at Vaughan Enterprises. The faces around the table were familiar, men and women he had worked with for years, many of whom owed their fortunes to his leadership. James sat at the far end, a satisfied smirk on his face. He clearly expected Richard to cave under pressure. "Before we begin," Richard said, his voice steady, "I want to address the concerns that prompted this meeting." He placed a folder on the table. "This contains information about Sarah Mills, the woman some of you believe is manipulating me." He took a deep breath. "What you'll find is the story of a woman who was left alone with a 5-year-old son when her husband died of cancer. A woman who, despite having no family support and minimal savings, refused to give up." Richard looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes in turn. "You'll find that she works 2 jobs to support her son, that she volunteers at his school despite her exhaustion, that she has never once been late on rent or missed a day of work." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You'll also find that she graduated top of her class in high school, but had to turn down a college scholarship because she was pregnant and determined to keep her child." James shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Richard, we're not questioning Ms. Mills's character. We're concerned about your judgment and the amount of company time and resources." "I haven't used a single dollar of company money," Richard interrupted. "Every investment I've made in Sarah's future has come from my personal accounts." He straightened to his full height, feeling more certain of himself than he had in years. "But you should know that I've learned more about true success from Sarah Mills in 2 months than I've learned in 30 years of business." The room was silent, everyone waiting to see where this was leading. "So," Richard continued, "if you want to vote me out because I'm helping a deserving family get on their feet, go ahead. But before you do, ask yourselves this. When was the last time any of us used our wealth to truly make a difference in someone's life?" The silence stretched on until finally one of the older board members spoke up. "I think we may have been hasty in calling this meeting," he said, looking around at his colleagues. "Richard has led this company to record profits for 20 years. If his personal life now includes mentoring a struggling family, that's hardly grounds for concern." One by one, the other board members nodded in agreement, all except James, whose face had darkened with anger. "This isn't over, Richard," James muttered as the meeting adjourned. "You're making a mistake getting involved with this woman." But Richard wasn't listening. He was already on his way out the door, heading to Sarah's business class graduation ceremony. Some things, he had finally realized, were far more important than boardroom politics. As he drove across town, Richard felt lighter than he had in years. The company he had built was important, but it wasn't worth sacrificing his newfound connection with Sarah and Tommy. When he arrived at the community college, he spotted Tommy immediately, sitting in the front row, wearing a tie that was slightly too big for him. The boy waved excitedly when he saw Richard. "She's next," Tommy whispered as Richard sat down beside him. Sure enough, the dean called out, "Sarah Mills with honors." Sarah walked across the stage in a simple blue dress, her face glowing with pride as she accepted her certificate. When she spotted Richard and Tommy in the audience, her smile widened and she gave them a small wave. In that moment, Richard knew he had made the right choice. Whatever challenges lay ahead, with his company, his brother, or the gossips of Westport, facing them would be worth it to be part of Sarah and Tommy's journey. What he didn't know was that the biggest challenge was yet to come, and it would test all 3 of them in ways they couldn't imagine. The grand opening of Sarah's home kitchen was just 2 weeks away. The once empty building in downtown Westport had been transformed into a warm, inviting restaurant with rustic decor that matched Sarah's vision perfectly. The kitchen gleamed with new equipment, and the dining area featured comfortable booths and tables made from reclaimed wood. Sarah stood in the middle of it all, clipboard in hand, checking off items on her seemingly endless to-do list. "The sign installation is scheduled for tomorrow," she told Richard, who was inspecting the newly installed light fixtures, "and the final health inspection is set for next week." Richard nodded, admiring how confidently Sarah moved through the Space. Gone was the exhausted hospital cleaner working 2 jobs. In her place stood a business owner who knew exactly what she wanted and how to get it. The newspaper wants to do a feature story on the restaurant, Richard mentioned. They're interested in your journey from hospital worker to entrepreneur. Sarah's expression flickered with uncertainty. I'm not sure that's a good idea. This is supposed to be about the food, not me. Before Richard could respond, Tommy burst in through the front door, followed by his new babysitter, Mrs. Chen, who watched him after school while Sarah worked on the restaurant. Mom, Richard, look what I got. Tommy held up a certificate proudly. Student of the Month. Sarah's face lit up as she knelt to hug her son. That's amazing, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you. Richard felt that familiar warmth in his chest as he watched them. Over the past 4 months, he had become deeply attached to both Sarah and Tommy. They had brought joy and purpose back to his life in ways he never expected. This calls for a celebration, Richard announced. How about dinner at Luigi's tonight? My treat. Tommy cheered, but Sarah gave Richard a look he was starting to recognize, her "you're being too generous" expression. We can celebrate right here, she countered. I need to test the new oven anyway. I'll make Tommy's favorite, my special lasagna. Richard knew better than to argue. Sarah's fierce independence was one of the things he admired most about her, even if it sometimes frustrated him. She accepted his help with the restaurant because they were business partners, but she drew clear lines when it came to personal matters. Later that evening, as they sat around Sarah's small kitchen table enjoying her delicious lasagna, Richard found himself thinking about how much his life had changed. Before meeting the Mills family, his evenings had been spent in solitary meals at expensive restaurants or working late at the office. Now, these simple dinners in Sarah's modest apartment were the highlight of his week. Earth to Richard, Sarah said, waving her hand in front of his face. You disappeared on us there. Richard smiled apologetically. Sorry, just thinking about how lucky I am to be having dinner with the student of the month and soon to be owner of Westport's best restaurant. Tommy beamed at the compliment, but Sarah's expression turned serious after Tommy went to do his homework. Richard, there's something I need to talk to you about, she said, refilling his coffee cup. It's about the restaurant opening. What's wrong? Is there a problem with the contractors? Sarah shook her head. No, everything's on schedule. It's just... She hesitated. I know you've invited a lot of important people from your business circle, and I'm worried about how they'll see me. Richard frowned. What do you mean? I mean, I'm not from their world. I don't have the right background or education. What if they think I'm just some charity case you took on? Her eyes met his, vulnerable in a way he rarely saw. What if they're right? Richard reached across the table and took her hand. Sarah, listen to me. You earned this. Every bit of it. Yes, I provided the opportunity, but you did the work. Those business classes, you aced them while still working full-time. The restaurant concept, all yours. The recipes, incredible. Sarah squeezed his hand gratefully, but didn't look entirely convinced. I just don't want to embarrass you. The only way you could embarrass me is if you served bad food, Richard joked, trying to lighten the mood. And after tasting this lasagna, I know that's impossible. Sarah laughed, the tension easing from her shoulders. But as Richard drove home that night, her concerns stayed with him. She was right that some in his social circle would view their partnership with suspicion, just as his brother and the board had. The business world could be cruel, especially to outsiders. The next morning, Richard was surprised to find James waiting in his office. We need to talk, James said without preamble. About this restaurant venture of yours, Richard sighed. I thought we settled this, James. The restaurant is my personal investment, not company business. James crossed his arms. That's not entirely true, is it? You've been using company resources. The legal team reviewed her contracts, marketing, is helping with promotion, and half the board has received invitations to the grand opening. I'm paying for those services separately, Richard pointed out. That's not the point. James slammed his hand on the desk. This woman has gotten into your head, Richard. Ever since you met her, you've been different, distracted, making decisions. That don't make business sense. Richard stood up slowly, his patience wearing thin. Be very careful what you say next, James. James lowered his voice, but his anger remained evident. I had her investigated, Richard. Did you know she was arrested when she was 19? Richard felt his blood run cold. What are you talking about? Shoplifting, James said triumphantly. She tried to steal medicine for her sick mother. Charges were dropped, but it's on her record. Did she tell you about that? Or about the fact that she was fired from her previous hospital job in Cleveland? Richard's mind raced. Frank's report had mentioned Sarah moving from Cleveland 5 years ago, but nothing about an arrest or being fired. You're lying, Richard said, but doubt had crept into his voice. James pulled a folder from his briefcase and tossed it on the desk. See for yourself. And while you're at it, ask yourself why she didn't tell you these things. What else might she be hiding? After James left, Richard sat staring at the folder, torn between loyalty to Sarah and the seed of doubt his brother had planted. Finally, he opened it and began to read. The shoplifting charge was there, just as James had said. 19-year-old Sarah had indeed been caught trying to steal cough medicine for her mother. But the store had dropped charges after learning the circumstances. As for the Cleveland hospital job, she hadn't been fired. She'd resigned after reporting a doctor for medical negligence. The hospital had tried to pressure her into silence, and when she refused, they had made her working conditions unbearable until she left. Richard closed the folder, a mixture of relief and shame washing over him. Sarah hadn't lied about anything. If anything, these revelations only confirmed what he already knew about her character. She was someone who stood up for what was right, even at personal cost. He reached for his phone to call her, then hesitated. Should he tell her about the investigation? About his moment of doubt? Or would that only hurt her and damage the trust they had built? Before he could decide, his assistant buzzed him. Mr. Vaughn, there's a Miss Henderson here to see you. She says it's urgent. Richard frowned. Patricia Henderson had resigned 2 weeks ago after he had confronted her about leaking information to James. Why would she be here now? Send her in. Patricia entered, looking uncomfortable, but determined. I won't take much of your time, Mr. Vaughn. I just thought you should see this. She handed him a tablet open to a gossip blog called Westport Whispers. The headline made his stomach drop. Billionaire's secret affair with hospital cleaner. The real dirt on Sarah Mills. The article was filled with half-truths and outright lies, claiming Sarah was a gold digger who had set her sights on Richard from the beginning, that she had a history of targeting wealthy men, and that the restaurant was just a way to launder Richard's money into her pocket. This went live an hour ago, Patricia said. It's already all over social media. Richard felt sick. Who would do this? Patricia's expression was grim. I have my suspicions. When I was still working here, I overheard James on the phone with someone at this blog. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now. Richard's shock quickly turned to fury. His own brother had stooped this low. Thank you for showing me this, Patricia. I owe you an apology for how things ended between us. Patricia shook her head. No, I was wrong about Ms. Mills. I let my loyalty to the company cloud my judgment. She paused. For what it's worth, I think she's been good for you, Mr. Vaughn. After Patricia left, Richard immediately called Sarah's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. He tried the restaurant number with the same result. Panic rising, he grabbed his keys and headed for the door. When he arrived at the restaurant, he found Sarah sitting alone at one of the tables, staring at her phone. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. Sarah, he began, moving toward her. She looked up, her expression a mixture of hurt and anger. Did you know about this? Is this why you really wanted to help me? Because you felt sorry for the poor single mom with the troubled past? No, Sarah, of course not. Richard sat across from her. I only learned about your past today, when James brought it up to try to turn me against you. So you did know, she said quietly. You just didn't tell me you knew. Richard took a deep breath. I should have told you immediately. I'm sorry, but none of it changes how I feel about you or Tommy. Sarah stood up abruptly. How you feel? Richard, this article calls me a gold digger. It says I seduced you to get your money. It talks about Tommy's father like he was some deadbeat who abandoned us, when he was a good man who died of cancer. Her voice broke. Tommy's teacher called me. Some of the parents have seen this. They're talking about it in front of the children. Richard felt a wave of guilt crash over him. In his world, gossip and bad press were just annoyances to be handled by the PR team. He hadn't considered how devastating this could be for Sarah and Tommy. "I'll fix this," he promised. "I'll have my lawyers shut down the blog, make them print a retraction." "You don't get it," Sarah interrupted. "Even if you could make the article disappear, people have already seen it. They're already whispering. Tommy and I have worked so hard to build a life here, and now," she gestured helplessly around the restaurant. "This place was supposed to be our fresh start, not another reason for people to look down on us." "The restaurant opening is in 2 weeks," Richard reminded her gently. "Once people taste your food, once they meet you and see what you've built, they won't care about some trashy gossip blog." Sarah wiped her eyes, clearly not convinced. "I don't know if I can do this, Richard. Maybe we should postpone the opening." "Give people time to forget." "That's exactly what James wants," Richard said firmly. "He's trying to sabotage us because he's afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Of you. Of the influence you have on me." Richard moved closer, taking her hands in his. "Sarah, before I met you and Tommy, I was just going through the motions. I had success, yes, but no real purpose. You showed me what really matters: kindness, integrity, love." Sarah looked down at their joined hands. "I never meant to come between you and your brother." "You didn't. James did that himself." Richard sighed. "The truth is, we've been heading in different directions for years. He sees the company as nothing but a money-making machine. I used to think the same way until you reminded me that business should also be about making a positive difference." Sarah finally met his eyes. "So what do we do now?" "We fight back," Richard said with determination. "Not by hiding or postponing, but by showing everyone exactly who you are. The amazing chef, devoted mother, and incredible woman I've come to." He stopped, suddenly aware of what he was about to say. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. "You've come to what, Richard?" Richard took a deep breath. After months of denying his feelings, of telling himself Sarah was just a friend he was helping, he couldn't hold back any longer. "I've come to love," he finished softly. "I love you, Sarah, and I love Tommy. You two have become the family I never thought I'd have." Sarah's expression was unreadable for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Richard, I care about you so much. You've done more for Tommy and me than anyone ever has, but—" Richard felt his heart sink at that "but." "I can't let my feelings for you cloud my judgment," she continued. "Right now, I need to focus on protecting Tommy and salvaging what we can of the restaurant. And I need to do it on my own terms, not as Richard Vaughan's charity case." Richard nodded slowly, trying to hide his disappointment. "I understand. What can I do to help?" Sarah thought for a moment. "I think I need some space to figure out what's best for Tommy and me." "Maybe you should step back from the restaurant opening." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. "You want me to stay away from the opening?" "Sarah, we're partners in this. And that's part of the problem," she said sadly. "As long as you're involved, people will say I didn't earn this, that I'm just riding on your success." "That's not true and you know it," Richard protested. "It doesn't matter what's true, it matters what people believe." Sarah ran her hand over the smooth tabletop. "This restaurant needs to succeed or fail on its own merits, on my cooking and my hard work. Not because the famous Richard Vaughan is backing it." Richard wanted to argue, to tell her she was making a mistake, but he respected her too much to push. "If that's what you want, I'll honor it, but know that I'm here if you need me, for anything." Sarah nodded, tears welling in her eyes again. "Thank you for understanding." As Richard left the restaurant, he felt as if he was walking away from everything that had come to matter to him. But he also knew that if he truly loved Sarah, he had to respect her decision. What he didn't know was that James Vaughan was far from finished with his plan to separate Richard from Sarah and Tommy, and that the worst was yet to come. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity for Sarah. Despite the gossip article, she threw herself into preparations for the restaurant opening with even more determination. If people were going to judge her, she would give them something real to judge. her food and her business acumen. For Richard, the days dragged painfully. He honored Sarah's request for space, limiting himself to brief text messages asking how preparations were going. Her responses were polite but distant, and each one made his heart ache a little more. He had his lawyers issue cease and desist letters to Westport Whispers and several other outlets that had picked up the story. The original article was taken down, but the damage had been done. In the privileged circles of Westport, Sarah Mills was now a topic of whispered conversation. 2 days before the restaurant opening, Richard was surprised to receive a visit from Tommy. The boy showed up at his office after school, looking serious beyond his years. "Tommy, is everything okay? Does your mom know you're here?" Richard asked, concerned. Tommy nodded. "Mrs. Chen brought me. Mum's really busy at the restaurant." He fidgeted with his backpack strap. "I need to talk to you about something important." Richard gestured to the chair across from his desk. "I'm all ears, buddy." Tommy sat down, his feet barely touching the floor. "Mom's really sad. She tries to hide it, but I can tell. And I think it's because you don't come to see us anymore." Richard's heart clenched. "Your mom asked for some space, Tommy. I'm trying to respect that." "But she misses you," Tommy insisted. "She was looking at pictures of us at the baseball game the other night, and she was crying." Richard didn't know what to say. He couldn't tell Tommy about the complicated adult situation, about the gossip, about James's interference, about his declaration of love that Sarah hadn't been ready to hear. "The restaurant opening is in 2 days," Tommy continued. "Mom says you're not coming, but I think you should. She needs you there, even if she won't say it." Richard sighed. "It's not that simple, Tommy. There are people saying mean things about your mom and me, and she thinks it would be better if I stay away for a while." Tommy's expression turned stubborn, so much like Sarah when she had made up her mind about something. "That's dumb. When kids at school said mean things about me being poor, you told me to hold my head high and show them who I really am. Why can't you and Mom do the same thing?" Out of the mouths of babes, Richard thought. Tommy had cut straight to the heart of the matter with the clarity only a child could have. "You're absolutely right, Tommy," Richard said slowly. "Running away and hiding isn't the answer. Your mom taught me that, to face challenges head-on." Tommy's face brightened. "So you'll come to the opening, please?" Richard hesitated. "I don't want to upset your mom." "I'll talk to her," Tommy promised. "I'll make her understand. Just promise you'll be there if she says it's okay." "I promise," Richard agreed, feeling a flicker of hope for the first time in weeks. After Tommy left, Richard sat thinking about everything that had happened since that fateful evening when he had given a hungry boy a burger. His life had been turned upside down in the best possible way. He wouldn't let his brother's jealousy or society gossip destroy what he had found with Sarah and Tommy. It was time to take a stand. And this time, he wouldn't just be fighting for his own happiness, but for theirs as well. The morning of the restaurant opening dawned clear and bright. Richard had not heard from Tommy or Sarah about whether he should attend, but he had made preparations just in case. He had also set another plan in motion, one that would hopefully put an end to James's interference once and for all. At his mansion, Richard dressed carefully in his best suit. Whether Sarah wanted him there or not, he needed to be ready as he adjusted his tie. His phone buzzed with a text message from Tommy. "Mom says you can come. She wants to talk to you before the opening. Be there at 4. Richard felt a surge of relief and anxiety. What did Sarah want to talk about? Had she reconsidered her feelings for him, or was she going to make their separation more permanent? Only one way to find out, he thought as he headed for his car. When he arrived at the restaurant at precisely 4 p.m., Sarah was there alone, looking breathtaking in a simple blue dress that matched her eyes. The tables were set with white tablecloths and fresh flowers. The kitchen was prepped and ready, and a grand opening banner hung across the entrance. "Tommy can be very persuasive when he wants to be," Sarah said by way of greeting. "He made some compelling arguments for why you should be here tonight." Richard smiled. "He's a smart kid. Gets it from his mother." An awkward silence fell between them, so different from their usual easy conversation. "Richard, I'm sorry," Sarah began. At the same moment, Richard said, "Sarah, I need to tell you—" They both stopped, then laughed, the tension breaking slightly. "Ladies first," Richard said. Sarah took a deep breath. "I'm sorry for pushing you away. I was scared and hurt by that article, and I lashed out at the person who least deserved it. These past 2 weeks without you have been—" She paused, searching for the right word: empty. "I realize that this restaurant, this opportunity, none of it means as much without you to share it with." Hope bloomed in Richard's chest, but he remained cautious. "What about the gossip? The people who will say you didn't earn this?" Sarah lifted her chin defiantly. "Let them talk. We know the truth. And after tonight, when they taste my food and see what we've built together, most of them will come around. Those who don't—" She shrugged. "Well, their opinion doesn't matter anyway." Richard stepped closer to her. "And what about what I said that day? About loving you and Tommy?" Sarah's eyes softened. "That's what I most regret, not telling you how I felt in return. The truth is, I fell in love with you months ago, Richard. But I was afraid to admit it, even to myself. Afraid you might see me differently once the novelty wore off. The only thing that's changed is that I love you more now than I did then," Richard said gently. "Every day I learn something new about you that makes me admire you more." Sarah moved into his arms, and Richard held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair. "So," she said after a moment, looking up at him with a smile, "are you ready to be my partner again, in all ways?" "More than ready," Richard replied, leaning down to kiss her softly. What neither of them knew was that James Vaughan was at that moment putting the final piece of his plan into motion, a plan that would threaten everything they had built together and test their newfound commitment in ways they couldn't imagine. The grand opening of Sarah's home kitchen was set to begin in just 2 hours. Sarah and Richard stood in the middle of the restaurant, taking in the beautiful space they had created. Together, the tables were set with elegant simplicity. Fresh flowers provided a touch of color, and the aroma of Sarah's signature dishes wafted from the kitchen where her newly hired staff was busy with final preparations. "I can't believe this is really happening," Sarah said, her voice filled with wonder. "A year ago I was cleaning hospital rooms at night and barely making ends meet." Richard squeezed her hand. "You earned this, Sarah, all of it." She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "We earned it together." The moment was interrupted by Tommy bursting through the front door, followed by Mrs. Chen. "Mom, Richard, there are news vans outside," Tommy exclaimed, his eyes wide with excitement. Richard frowned. "News vans? We didn't invite any television stations." Sarah's face paled. "Do you think it's because of that gossip article? Maybe they're here to dig up more dirt." Richard's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from his assistant. "Turn on Channel 6 News now." Richard quickly pulled out his tablet and opened the news app. The headline made his blood run cold. Vaughan. Enterprises under federal investigation for fraud. The report showed footage of federal agents entering the Vaughan Enterprises headquarters, carrying boxes of documents. The reporter's voice explained that the company was being investigated for alleged financial irregularities related to overseas accounts. "This is James," Richard said grimly. "He's trying to create a scandal to overshadow your opening night." Sarah stared at the screen in horror. "Can he really do that? Trigger a federal investigation just to spite us?" Richard's expression darkened. "James has been managing our international divisions for years. If he's done something illegal and is now bringing it to light to hurt me—" He didn't finish the thought, but the implication was clear. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, glancing anxiously at the clock. "Guests will start arriving soon." Richard took a deep breath, steadying himself. "We go forward as planned. I won't let James ruin this night for you." Sarah shook her head. "For us, Richard, this is our restaurant, our dream." Tommy, who had been watching them with concern, spoke up. "Mom always says that when things get tough, that's when you find out what you're made of." Richard smiled at the boy's wisdom. "Your mum is absolutely right, buddy." He turned to Sarah. "I need to make some calls, deal with this situation, but I promise I'll be back before the first guests arrive." Sarah nodded, though worry still creased her brow. "Do what you need to do." As Richard headed for the door, Sarah called after him. "Richard, whatever happens with the company, we're in this together now. The simple declaration of solidarity nearly brought tears to Richard's eyes. "I know," he said softly, "and that makes all the difference." Outside, Richard found the news vans setting up for live broadcasts. Reporters immediately swarmed him, shoving microphones in his face. "Mr. Vaughan, what do you have to say about the federal investigation? Are the allegations of fraud true? Will you be stepping down as CEO?" Richard held up his hands for silence. "I have no comment at this time, except to say that Vaughan Enterprises has always operated with the highest ethical standards. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a restaurant opening to attend." In his car, Richard made a series of urgent phone calls, first to his head of legal, then to the company's crisis management team, and finally to the board chairman. The situation was serious, but not as dire as the news made it seem. The federal agents were responding to an anonymous tip, almost certainly from James, about accounting irregularities in the Asian Markets Division, James's division. "We have nothing to hide," the head of legal assured him. "But it will take time to sort through everything." Richard's final call was to the private investigator, Frank. "I need everything you can find on James's financial activities, both company and personal, in the next 24 hours. With that done, Richard took a moment to collect himself. The company he had built from the ground up was facing its biggest crisis ever. Years ago, this would have consumed him completely. But now, as he glanced at his watch and realized it was time to head back to the restaurant, he understood that Vaughan Enterprises was no longer the most important thing in his life. When he returned to Sarah's home kitchen, the first guests were already arriving. Sarah stood at the door, greeting everyone with a warm smile, looking every bit the confident restaurant owner, despite the chaos unfolding across town. "Everything okay?" she asked quietly when she saw Richard. "It will be," he assured her. "Tonight is about you and this amazing restaurant." As more guests filed in, Richard noticed that despite the scandal breaking on the news, nearly everyone they had invited had shown up. Westport's elite were never ones to miss potential drama, and the combination of a new upscale restaurant and the whiff of scandal was too enticing to pass up. What surprised Richard most was how many people made a point of approaching him and Sarah to express their support. "Don't let those vultures in the media get you down," said Eleanor Whittington, one of Westport's most prominent socialites. "They tried to run my Harold out of business 30 years ago with similar tactics. Best thing is to carry on with your head high." Sarah glanced at Richard, clearly touched by the unexpected support. "Thank you, Mrs. Whittington. That means a lot." By the time dinner service was in full swing, the atmosphere in the restaurant was buzzing with positive energy. Sarah's food was receiving rave reviews, with many guests declaring it the best meal they'd had in Westport in years. Tommy moved between tables with surprising grace for a 10-year-old, charming the guests with his earnest descriptions of his mother's cooking. "My mum's been making this pot roast since I was little," he told one table. "It's even better than my grandma's, but don't tell her I said that." Richard watched Sarah in her element, directing the kitchen staff with quiet authority, while occasionally stepping out to greet guests. The transformation from the exhausted hospital cleaner he'd met months ago was remarkable, yet the essence of who she was, her kindness, her integrity, her strength, remained unchanged. As the evening was drawing to a successful close, Richard noticed a commotion at the entrance. James had arrived, looking immaculate in an expensive suit but with a coldness in his eyes that contrasted sharply with the warm atmosphere of the restaurant. "Quite a turnout, brother," James said as he approached Richard, "especially given the circumstances." Richard kept his voice level. "What are you doing here, James?" "I was invited, wasn't I? As a board member of Vaughan Enterprises." James glanced around the restaurant with calculated disdain. "Quaint little place. Very homey." "If you've come to cause trouble." "Trouble?" James interrupted with mock innocence. "The trouble's already started, Richard. I'm just here to watch it unfold." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "By this time tomorrow, the board will be calling for your resignation. All your little charity projects will be shut down, including this one. And your girlfriend and her son will be back where they belong, scraping by on the edges of society." Before Richard could respond, Sarah appeared at his side. "James," she acknowledged coolly. "I don't..." believe we've been properly introduced. I'm Sarah Mills, Richard's partner." James's smile didn't reach his eyes. "The famous Sarah Mills. I've heard so much about you." "Funny, I've heard quite a bit about you as well," Sarah replied evenly. "None of it particularly flattering." James's expression hardened. "Enjoy your moment in the spotlight while it lasts. By this time tomorrow—" "I know all about your prediction for tomorrow," Sarah interrupted. "Richard told me everything." "What I don't understand is why you're so determined to hurt your own brother." James's mask of civility slipped slightly. "You don't know anything about my relationship with Richard. I know that family should support each other, not tear each other down," Sarah said. "I know that there's enough success to go around without trying to destroy someone else's happiness." James laughed bitterly. "Such simple wisdom from a simple woman. No wonder Richard finds you refreshing after years of dealing with real business people." Richard stepped forward, his patience finally exhausted. "That's enough, James. I want you to leave." "Or what?" James challenged. "You'll have me thrown out. Create a scene at your girlfriend's big debut. The reporters outside would love that." "Actually," came a voice from behind them, "I think the reporters would be more interested in these." They turned to see Patricia Henderson standing there holding a folder. "Patricia," James said, clearly surprised to see Richard's former assistant. "What are you doing here?" Patricia handed the folder to Richard. "I've been doing some investigating of my own, Mr. Vaughan. After I left the company, I took a position with the accounting firm that handles the Asian markets division." Richard opened the folder and quickly scanned its contents, his expression changing from confusion to shock to grim understanding. "You've been embezzling from the company," he said quietly to James. "Setting up fake vendors, skimming from contracts, hiding money in offshore accounts." James's face drained of color. "That's absurd. You can't prove anything." "Actually, we can," Patricia said calmly. "I've already provided copies of these documents to the federal investigators. They're very interested in speaking with you." James looked around wildly like a cornered animal. "This is a setup. You're trying to frame me to save yourself." "No, James," Richard said sadly. "You did this to yourself." "And for what?" "Because I found happiness with Sarah and Tommy. Because I started using my wealth to help others instead of just accumulating more." Before James could respond, two men in suits approached. They flashed badges identifying them as federal agents. "James Vaughan," one of them said. "We'd like to ask you some questions about certain financial irregularities we've uncovered." As the agents led a shell-shocked James away, the restaurant had fallen silent, all eyes on the unfolding drama. Richard turned to find Sarah and Tommy standing together watching him with concern. "I'm sorry," he said, moving to join them. "This isn't how I wanted your opening night to end." To his surprise, Sarah smiled. "Actually, I think it's perfect. Justice being served along with dessert." She glanced around at the riveted guests. "Besides, this kind of excitement is better than any advertising we could have bought." Richard laughed despite the gravity of the situation. "You're amazing, do you know that?" "I'm starting to believe it," she replied. Tommy tugged at Richard's sleeve. "Does this mean your company is going to be okay?" Richard knelt down to the boy's level. "It means there will be some challenges ahead, but yes, the company will be fine. More importantly, we'll be fine." As the excitement died down and guests resumed their conversations, now with the added spice of real-life drama to discuss, Richard found himself feeling strangely at peace. The worst had happened. The scandal, the investigation, the public confrontation with James, yet he felt lighter than he had in years. The restaurant gradually emptied as the evening came to a close. The staff began cleaning up, and Tommy fell asleep in one of the booths, exhausted from the excitement. Sarah and Richard sat at a small table by the window, sharing a slice of her homemade apple pie. "Some opening night," Sarah said, shaking her head in disbelief. "I'd say it was a rousing success," Richard replied. "The food was fantastic. The guests loved it, and we exposed a corporate criminal. Not bad for your first day in business." Sarah laughed, then grew serious. "What happens now? With the company? With James?" Richard sighed. "James will likely face criminal charges. As for the company, there will be investigations, possibly some restructuring, but we'll weather it." "And us?" Sarah asked softly. Where do we go from here? Richard reached across the table to take her hand. Wherever you want, Sarah. I meant what I said before. I love you and Tommy. You've changed my life in ways I never imagined possible. Sarah's eyes shimmered with emotion. When Tommy's father died, I thought that was it for me. I focused all my energy on surviving, on making sure Tommy had what he needed. I never expected to find love again. She squeezed his hand. But then you gave my hungry son a burger and everything changed. Richard smiled at the memory. Best investment I ever made. You know, Sarah said thoughtfully, Tommy asked me something interesting the other day. He wanted to know if you were going to be his new dad. Richard's heart skipped a beat. What? Did you tell him? I told him that was a question you and I would need to discuss. She met his gaze steadily. So what do you think? Is that something you might want someday? Richard didn't hesitate. I already think of Tommy as my son, and you, Sarah Mills, as the woman I want to spend the rest of my life with. So yes, that's definitely something I want, if you'll have me. Sarah's face lit up with joy. I think that could be arranged. They were interrupted by a sleepy Tommy, who had wandered over from his booth. Is it time to go home? Richard and Sarah exchanged a look filled with love and understanding. Yes, Sarah said, putting her arm around her son. It's time to go home. They locked up the restaurant and stepped outside into the cool night air. Richard looked back at the glowing sign, Sarah's Home Kitchen. The name had taken on a new meaning for him. Home wasn't his empty mansion on the hill. It wasn't the corporate headquarters with his name on the building. Home was wherever Sarah and Tommy were, the family he had found when he least expected. Yet 6 months later, Sarah's Home Kitchen had become the most popular restaurant in Westport. Sarah had expanded to offering cooking classes during the day, teaching others the skills her mother and grandmother had passed down to her. Richard had weathered the corporate storm caused by James's crimes. While his brother awaited trial, Richard had restructured the company, bringing in new leadership and implementing stricter ethical guidelines. But he had also stepped back from day-to-day operations, choosing instead to focus on the philanthropic arm of Vaughan Enterprises. Together with Sarah, he had established the Mills Vaughan Foundation, which provided educational opportunities and business startup grants for single parents. Their first initiative was renovating the Oakwood apartments into safe, affordable housing for working families. On a warm Sunday afternoon, the restaurant was closed to the public for a special private event. Tables had been pushed aside to create an open space in the center, which was decorated with simple white flowers. Sarah stood nervously in the small office, wearing an elegant cream-colored dress. Tommy, looking grown up in his new suit, waited with her. You look beautiful, Mom, he said, straightening his tie just like Richard had taught him. Are you ready for this, sweetheart? Sarah asked. It's a big change. Tommy rolled his eyes. Mom, Richard already feels like my dad. This just makes it official. Sarah smiled, marveling at her son's resilience and wisdom. When did you get so smart? Richard says I get it from you, Tommy replied with a grin. There was a soft knock at the door. Mrs. Chen peeked in. It's time. Sarah took a deep breath and nodded. Tommy offered his arm to his mother, just as they had practiced, and led her out into the restaurant. Richard waited at the front, looking handsome and slightly nervous in his grey suit. When he saw Sarah, his face transformed with a look of such pure love that tears sprang to her eyes. The ceremony was simple and intimate, attended only by close friends they had made over the past year. Eleanor Whittington dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Patricia Henderson smiled from her seat near the front. Even some of Sarah's former co-workers from the hospital had come to celebrate. When it came time for the vows, Richard took Sarah's hands in his. Sarah, when I met you and Tommy, I was a man who had everything and nothing at the same time. I had success, wealth, power, all the things the world told me were important. But I was empty inside. His voice caught with emotion. You showed me what true richness is. Kindness, integrity, love. You repaid a simple act of charity with something priceless, a family. I promised to spend the rest of my life being worthy of that gift. Sarah's voice trembled as she spoke her vows. Richard, you came into our lives when I had stopped believing. saying happy endings. You saw value in me when I had forgotten to see it in myself. You helped me build not just a business, but a new life. She smiled through her tears. They say you can't repay kindness. You can only pass it on. But I think they're wrong. Every day my love for you grows stronger, and that's my heart's repayment for everything you've given us. After they were pronounced husband and wife, Richard knelt down to Tommy's level. Tommy, I want you to know that while I'm marrying your mum today, I'm making a promise to you too. I will always be there for you, to guide you, support you, and love you as my son. Tommy surprised everyone by pulling a folded paper from his pocket. I wrote something too, he said seriously. Richard and Sarah exchanged touched glances as Tommy unfolded his note. Richard, Tommy read carefully. Thank you for the burger that day. It was really good. But thank you more for making my mum happy and giving us a better life. I promise to be a good son and make you both proud. He looked up, his face solemn. And I promise to always remember that we should help people who need it, just like you helped us. There wasn't a dry eye in the room as Richard pulled Tommy into a hug. Sarah joined them, the three of them embracing as a family at last. Later, as their friends celebrated around them, Richard and Sarah stood by the window where they had shared apple pie on opening night. Happy? Richard asked, his arm around her waist. Sarah looked around at the restaurant full of joy and laughter, at Tommy showing Mrs. Chen his new video game, at the life they had built together from such an unlikely beginning. More than I ever thought possible, she replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. Who would have thought that a simple meal could change so many lives? Richard smiled, thinking of that fateful evening when he had knelt beside a hungry boy outside a restaurant. The meal that started it all, he agreed. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes filled with love. No, the kindness that started it all. The meal was just your way of showing it. As they rejoined their guests, Richard reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a chance encounter to a shared life, from a simple gesture of giving to receiving more than he could have imagined in return. It had begun with a burger given to a hungry child. It had grown into a love that nourished not just the body, but the soul. And that, Richard knew, was the most precious repayment of all. The end.